Thanks for joining me on this session. So we're going to talk about generative AI and logic apps, and really looking forward to this session. I think this is a very exciting space, and hope you enjoy it as well. So let's talk a little bit about our generative AI strategy, and it really comes down to sort of two key aspects. The first is about developer productivity, and how we can infuse AI in our tools to help you with development. When we say help, that can mean a few different things. Can we make things simpler for you to go ahead and accomplish? Can we allow you to go ahead and do that quicker and reduce the time to market or time to value? The second side of this is how you can use generative AI building blocks in your solutions to go ahead and achieve a business outcome. And so that's the second part of the strategy. So let's talk a little bit about the first part, and that has to do with our workflow assistant that currently is in the Logic Apps Workflow Designer. Now, what this is a chat-based interface that allows you to essentially go ahead and chat with your particular Logic app, your workflow in this case. And so what we're able to do is to provide an experience that allows you to ask questions about the workflow in question. So describe this workflow. What does this workflow do? The other thing that it allows you to do is to ask questions about the particular workflow. So, how do I go ahead and accomplish this specific task? Like, how do I go ahead and include custom code in this solution? And the response should give you some prescriptive guidance on how you go ahead and achieve that. The other thing you can also ask is just some integration best practices. So if you were interested in a particular pattern, like how do I achieve pub sub or in order delivery, it should also provide you with some guidance so that you don't actually have to context switch and leave the design experience and head over to your favorite web search in order to go ahead and try to find those answers. So here's a few different examples or samples, and this is all available today right now. So within the context of a specific workflow, we can go ahead and ask, describe this workflow. And what it'll do is actually go ahead and list out what this workflow is trying to achieve. Now, it isn't just as simple as reading all of the triggers and actions and basically just saying, hey, this action, this action, this action. It'll also go ahead and inspect what those actions are doing and what those dependencies might be. So if there is sort of an expression that is used downstream from a previous action, it'll go ahead and call out some of those items. The other thing is, hey, how do I go ahead and, in this case, send an email? Or how do I go ahead and use custom code? So you can ask for some recommendations, and it will go ahead and provide some recommendations for you. Another one is testing, and this is kind of on the lighter weight side of things, but for example, you've got a trigger, and that HTTP trigger has a schema that's exposed, and you want to be able to go ahead and generate a sample message that you can go ahead and send into that workflow. That's something that it can go ahead and do. It'll actually look in the trigger, see the schema, and generate a sample message for you. You can also use this when composing workflow definition expressions as well. So sometimes those can be a little bit finicky. You can actually go ahead and say, create an expression based upon this particular action output. It'll go ahead and provide that. You can then copy and paste it into your specific workflow. And then this is that last one around design patterns. So in this case, it was like, hey, how do I implement sequential processing of events? And here it talks about using a sequential convoy, and also like to recommend using service bus. So this is providing some level of prescription for your benefit. Now, this is kind of just our initial launch of the workflow assistant. This is something where now that we've got this out, we actually get reinforcement. When you go ahead and use it, you give us a thumbs up, you give us a thumbs down, and there's some additional scenarios that we're actively working on as well. So the ability to go ahead and create a workflow using natural language. So being able to provide a prompt that says, create a workflow that does A, B, C, D, and E, and it will go ahead and generate basically a sample workflow that you can review. and then you can choose to approve it or request updates. And at the end of the day, you should have a workflow that you can get started with. Certainly the ability to edit that workflow after the fact. So I've already provisioned it. Oh, let's replace this action with a different action, implement this particular condition. Being able to go ahead and edit that workflow is another area that we're working on. The third one is particularly interesting in my mind. This is data mapping. I think when we talk about data transformation, that is typically a task that takes up a lot of developer time, and it's naturally pretty important. But if there's a way to be able to take, say, sample messages and then be able to auto-generate a map, I think that represents a huge opportunity from a productivity standpoint for you to be able to go ahead and address some of those use cases. And then last, we kind of have a little bit of this today when we say describe this flow, but we'll make this a little bit more formal, give you the ability to export this as a PDF or document, and you can include this in your change management. I'm sure you regularly go through change management exercises, and that's a little bit of a tax that you generally have to pay. So if there is a way to be able to automate these types of things, that should also provide a lot of benefit as well. So that's kind of the first part of the strategy. Let's now talk a little bit about the second part of the strategy and how you can use generative AI to build more interesting applications. So this is a little bit of my personal opinion, but I think there's this general perception that whenever we talk about generative AI, it always represents this is a new thing. We need to create something new, and that AI needs to be in the middle of this new application, and everything is greenfield. And I don't think that that's always the case. I think naturally that, in many circumstances that is true, but I don't think it always is the case. And I definitely don't think that's the case when we talk about integration. And I think the narrative can be a little bit different. And that's really the message that I hope to share here this morning. So when you think about your integration landscape, think about all of the data that's moving through your environment, through your architecture. So you've got some pretty interesting and valuable data there. You've got work orders, you might have inventory, you've got purchase order, financial statements, customer service tickets. This is all information that your organization or the organizations you work for feels is valuable enough that you should go share this amongst your other systems. And so you go ahead and you build this integration. And so this is one of those things where I'm sure you've all been part of these particular projects where you do all of the plumbing, you do all of this integration, these systems are talking to each other, they're using the data that they need to complete a particular business process, and then you have this very large data warehouse project that follows it. And you go ahead and you do a bunch of ETL or ELT from all of those various systems, and you put it into this data warehouse so you can build static reports on top of it. And I think this is one of those opportunities that shifts or changes when we talk about large language models and the ability to integrate those into your iPaaS platform itself. And so if you think about the type of information that's already moving through your system, this is really that opportunity to be able to reason on top of all of that data in a very consolidated manner. It was interesting, had a lot of conversations, great conversations yesterday on this topic, and one of the topics or conversations involved, well, I'm just not sure what the use cases are. And this is where I'd really encourage you to go ahead and look at your landscape and look at the data that's moving through your landscape. And I really feel like there's use cases that are right underneath your nose at this point, and it's just a matter of going ahead and discovering them. So without question, business processes will be reinvented with AI. New apps will be built that previously weren't really possible or were very difficult to go ahead and achieve. And just maybe a brief story just on the conversational agents. So I've been on the Logic Apps team about 2.5 years. Before that, I spent 2 years with the Power Virtual Agents team. And we were working on large-scale chatbots for customers all over the world. And we always talked about this sort of evolution of chatbots that were being built. And the problem with them was that you would always have to sort of define what those paths would be. Kind of like we create workflows to integrate systems, you would typically create workflows that represent a conversation. There's a series of back and forth. And everything was very much structured. But I think the notion of that changes everything with LLMs, in the sense that you can now talk to this data without a lot of rigid conversations. And I think, through the demo here that I'm going to show you, hopefully that does come across. Now, one of sort of the key enablers of generative AI use cases with logic apps is this pattern called the RAG pattern, Retrieval, Augmented Generation Pattern. And there's really kind of two paths that take place, and we're going to see this in the upcoming demo. We've got the first path, which is ingestion, the ingestion of data. So that data can come in the forms of documents, but it can also come in the form of messages. And these can be structured messages, which what you're going to see in the demo, or these can be unstructured documents, which you see in a lot of other demos itself. Now, there's a series of steps that need to take place as part of ingesting this data. It starts with tokenization. Then you go ahead and generate embeddings, and today you do that using the Azure OpenAI service. And then you go ahead and index and store these vectors, and that takes place in Azure Search. So kind of the opportunity here from a logic apps perspective is that we've built connectors. These are built-in connectors that allow you to go ahead and call these operations and to be able to do that in a very quick and efficient manner. Now, once your data is in the LLM, naturally you want to be able to retrieve and search and reason on top of that data. So this is a separate process where a prompt is exposed. Basically, you're asking your end user, your customer, to express interest in a topic, or an utterance, which is also used quite frequently. When you get, basically it's a question at the end of the day, then there's an embedding that gets generated. We then do a vector DB search, and then we provide a response based upon related segments and prompts. Once again, these are all building blocks that do exist. And so this was something that Slava had shown a little bit yesterday, where you can go ahead and do these. You can go ahead and write the Python code or the Bash code to go ahead and achieve this, and that's fine if that's sort of how you want to spend your time. But I think the opportunity from our perspective is like, how do we use these connectors and use a workflow to go ahead and address these needs? And so I like to look at, when we talk about why logic apps and AI, I kind of look at it very similar as why logic apps, right? We want to be able to democratize who can build these solutions. We want to make it simple to do, and we want you to be able to do it quickly. And I don't think that should change when we sort of bring AI into the picture as well. And so, these are connectors. I've got a slide in a few clicks here that says they're GA, but we'll save that when we get there. So let's talk a little bit about a demo. So you saw this yesterday, and we talked a little bit about the process that you work through in order to complete this business process. We talked about safety management when it came to the hybrid logic apps, but we also have these purple rectangles or squares on here that talk about LLM. And so I deliberately chose this specific use case. And many of you may have seen this use case in the past, and this was very deliberate. So I didn't actually have to change my application. I didn't have to change my integration in order to achieve this, right? Like through pub/sub messaging, through our friends of Service Bus and the Azure messaging team, we can now go ahead and attach essentially a consumer that will now go ahead and extract key information from the solution and now publish this to our LLM. Now in this case, it comes from the work order management completion. So we've completed the work order, we know how long we've spent, we know who the customer is, we know who the technician is, we know if there was a safety incident, we know if there was materials that were used. That sounds like information that would be quite interesting for either sort of an inventory person or certainly a customer service lead to be able to go ahead and query on top of this data to better understand the overall impact on the business process. And I think this goes back to some of those earlier slides where if you think about your existing processes today, there must be points in that journey which represent some interesting data for your customers or for your stakeholders. And so let's go ahead and just take a look at what we've got here. Okay, so yesterday I showed you integration environment. And as part of integration environment, what I did here, I didn't have to create a new app, but I did create a new app and added it to the integration application, and I just called it Work Order Gen AI. And as part of this app, I've got two workflows, the ingestion workflow, and then basically the retrieval workflow itself. So we can go in and, here, let's, there we go. All right, so here's our workflow. So we've got the service bus trigger. In this case, I am using a queue, but when a message arrives on a queue, I can go ahead and just parse that particular work order. I talked about some of the attributes that we're going to go ahead and collect here: ticket number, city, customer name, material description, etc. Then we'll go ahead and we'll call out. In this case, we are calling out to an Azure function. We're going to go ahead and tokenize the document. Basically break it down, and then we can start to use these other connectors. So we can go ahead and get the embeddings from the OpenAI service, and we can go ahead and index the documents as well. So we'll go ahead and we'll process this. And so what would have happened yesterday when we ran through the particular demo is we would have naturally, as work orders are being completed, let me collapse this. We would have gone ahead and processed that information and published it over to the LLM. Now, the next side is once we've got the data that exists in the LLM, we can now naturally go ahead and search. Now, this might lend itself quite well to a stateless workflow, but in this case it is stateful. But if you wanted some reduced latency, you could go ahead and do that. And here all we're going to do is go ahead and expose an HTTP request. And it's a very simple schema. Basically, we have a string as a prompt. Basically, gives you the opportunity to ask a question. Here, this is where we can go ahead and set some parameters around like what we want the LLM to do. So we can impose some restrictions on, because this is always a key governance piece, is like what do you want the LLM to return, and then if there's things you don't want it to return as well. So we can provide some sample responses. We'll go ahead and we'll execute the query, we'll get the embeddings, we'll do the search, and then we'll naturally go ahead and provide the response. So what we can do is, I'm just in Postman now, and if you recall yesterday, we had a safety incident, and that safety incident included some slippery conditions. And so here, from a prompt perspective, I can go ahead and say, hey, do we have any safety incidents where the safety assessment includes slippery conditions? And then if so, please provide the case number and details. And sometimes you need to be a little bit explicit with this stuff, because you can say, hey, did we have any safety incidents? And it'll say yes, right? So you need to be a little bit more descriptive in terms of like what you expect it to follow up with it. So here, we can see that we've had some safety incidents, and we've got the particular cases, right? So 1179, and then here we've got the source. What that represents is when I go ahead and ingest the document, I can pass IDs or references to that actual data itself so that you know where this is coming from. So let's go ahead, let's go back to business process tracking, and let's look up, the case 1179. And sure enough, we can go ahead and see that, yeah, we did have a safety incident. And if we wanted to find out like more information about that, so this was the technician name, unfortunately, was Stephen Smith. And so let's make sure that that is correct. And sure enough, we see Steve Smith. So we know that we haven't, experienced any sort of hallucinations from that perspective. Now, another scenario, and here's the other important thing, is I have not pre-programmed any of these scenarios. I have not gone in and said like, hey, this is a special field called technician, I want you to pay attention to it. I haven't done anything like that. And so same thing, here, do we have any work orders where the customer name is Stephen Thomas? And so sure enough, we'll make this request. And here we can see we've got two cases, 1179 and 1167. So let's go back over here, and sure enough, if we go to 1179, ticket created, Stephen Thomas. I have not shown any special treatment to Stephen Thomas in this case, right? This is just me being able to go ahead and query over the data. The other thing that's pretty interesting here is that there's not a lot of latency here. Like if I go ahead and run this and put in a unique value and we flip right over and run the query, you're gonna get the result. There's not like latency here where it's like, oh, next day you'll find out that information. This is happening in near real time. So let's go back and just see a couple other scenarios. So our favorite technician, right? So Mick, Super Mick. So let's see, what was his last case number? And so sure enough, we can see 1181 was the last case number. If we head back over to business process tracking, we can go ahead and we should see that this was dispatched to Mick Badron. Now, let's see if Mick did a good job. Now this will just show you that it's real. So here, they did say this was Mick's case. However, the data hasn't provided whether or not he performed well. So sorry, Mick, no bonus for you. But this just sort of reinforced it didn't make things up. Now, we did talk about it, the overall business process. We sent out a customer survey. And if we did get customer survey back about the technician's performance, naturally we could include that. And if we go back and ask this question once again, the response would be different, I suppose. And then this is another sort of use case in the sense of are there any recommendations on how we can reduce incidents when visiting customer locations when it's wet or snowy? Now, you naturally could ingest safety documents into your LLM and give very much corporate specific guidance here. But this is because this is just a general model that we're using, it's just gonna go ahead and provide some additional guidance, some recommendations. So this is nothing I programmed in, nothing that I loaded into the LLM. This is part of just the general model that was available through Azure OpenAI. Now there might be some of these that make sense for you. They might make some of these that that are great, some that aren't. But this just also goes to show that this is like a broader data set. This is more than just my corporate data, but I've enriched the general model with my own corporate data, and naturally I'd have the ability to go ahead and to sort of enhance or supplement this as well. All right, so that's that for the demo. So there is, as I mentioned before, these connectors, they did come out in preview, I guess it was kind of January-ish. Now we've seen a lot of interest in these particular connectors. We've had some customers that have said, yeah, we really like what you're doing. Please make these GA so that we can use them in production. And here we are. So, and Daniel Probert, here's your QR code. So these are our GA. Do go ahead and check them out. There's a link there to learn more. Feel free to reach out. We're definitely interested in use cases. We're definitely interested in understanding what we could do in addition to what we currently offer, just to make your experience even better. Okay. All right, so this is the next part. So LLMs are definitely interesting, and hopefully that demo sort of gave you a few ideas in terms of how you can use it yourself. Now, one of the challenges with LLMs is, they understand data, that was either historical data or data at a point in time, right? So if I go ahead and say, tell me what are the open cases, in this case, the LLM would have no idea what are the open cases because I've only fed it cases that have been completed. And this is one of those things, you shouldn't use your LLM as a database either, right? So you want to make sure that the data that you're putting into it provides value. So how do we sort of complement an existing LLM solution and enable the real-time access to data as well? And so that's what plugins offer us. And so, I kind of summarized a little bit of this, but another piece of this is that LLMs will sort of give you guidance on what you could do, but it kind of feels like it's assigning you work, right? Like it's like, if I asked a question of like, how do I fix my computer, or how do I sort of go ahead and address this issue, it might say, step 1, do this, step 2, do this, step 3, do this. And then you're like, oh, I just got homework. So now I get to go ahead and do a bunch of work. But what if you can go ahead and automate some or all of those steps? And really, I look at this as automating the last mile. This is where you can go ahead and achieve even more productivity if you're able to go ahead and transact on behalf of the user. And this was another sort of lesson I learned in, when working with the Power Virtual Agents team, is that customers would always or often sort of start with an FAQ bot. General frequently asked questions. How do I do this? How do I do that? The usage would initially spike because it's like, oh, this is cool. We got a chatbot, and it wasn't that hard to build. And then what would happen is that data would get stale, and there wouldn't be a whole lot of value there, so they wouldn't actually go back to the chatbot because it wasn't actually, automating their next step. And I think LLMs help this for sure because it's easy to ingest the data versus you having to construct a lot of manual conversations. But where we found a lot of value was when you actually remove the work. If you remove the work from a user, now you're truly going after benefits. You're going after value, and that's really through automation. And that's what a plugin provides you the ability to go ahead and do. And so we've been working with a few different teams. You're going to see a couple here in these slides, but Azure OpenAI in particular, and also the semantic kernel team, where we can go ahead and include logic apps as a plugin. And part of the reason why we fit in really well here is our library of connectors. So more than 1,000 different connectors that exist that allow you to transact, and the key word is transact, with those different LOB systems. So instead of giving someone instructions to go complete 5 steps in SAP, why don't you complete those 5 steps for them and use the connectors to go ahead and automate that work and actually remove the work. So these things really work hand in hand, the LLM plus the ability to go ahead and use plugins. And so the first one I want to talk about is Azure OpenAI. They have a feature called Assistance. And you can think of it kind of like a chatbot that sits on top of an LLM. And this is one of those things where I call it a low-code-ish approach to doing this, where they give you a lot of these building blocks to go ahead and build these conversational applications. And they have this extensibility point. And this extensibility point is called functions. Nothing to do with Azure Functions, so just called functions. And those functions can be sort of 2 things at this point. Custom code, you can go ahead and write some code to achieve something. And then there's also logic apps. And so in this case, we provide an experience you can see there on the screen where you can click logic apps. It'll enumerate the consumption-based logic apps that you do have access to. We will be working on standard as well in the near future. And then what you can go ahead and do is, and this will enumerate logic apps that have an HTTP request. It'll then go ahead and suck in that logic app schema. It'll look at the request trigger. It'll understand what are the inputs that are required. And then what it'll then do is plug you in to sort of that conversation as a function. So I've got a demo here. This is Azure OpenAI Studio. I've got a deployment of a model. In this case, it's a GPT 3.5 Turbo. And then what I'm going to do is go ahead and create an assistant. I just choose that deployment that I just mentioned, provide it a name. This is going to be kind of like my chatbot name. I can then provide it instructions on what that chat experience is supposed to do. It's supposed to help in assisting questions about power outages for city power and light employees. And then what I can now go ahead and do is, like here, I'm just going to show that this thing works. I can say hi, ask a question, and this is going to go ahead and retrieve information from the model itself. This is not customer-enriched data. This is just a general question about best practices in avoiding power outages. And so it's going to come up and talk about maintenance and tree trimming and underground power lines. It seems all quite reasonable, but once again, this is not corporate data. But I could enrich it if I wanted to. I could upload documents that would supplement or override some of that capabilities. Now, in this case, I do want to add the ability to look up open tickets that exist in our solution, and to be able to return that to the chatbot. So here I'm going to find a consumption logic app called Get Active Tickets. It exposes basically a city name as the input as part of the request schema, and now it's added to my chat experience here. So I'm just going to go ahead and ask it for some open tickets in a particular city. I think it might be Kirkland, I can't recall. And then that'll get passed over to that logic app, and Kirkland, and it'll then go ahead and find any of the open tickets for Kirkland. And so here we can see that we've got a case 1163 that is part of it, and I can say, can you tell me anything more about this particular case? Now in this case, no pun intended, it's only going to go ahead and give you more information on stuff it knows about. So I haven't told it a lot of things as part of that response, but the more I sort of tell it, the more I have access to from that perspective. So here it's basically saying it's in a created status, but it doesn't have more details than that. So if you're looking for more information, go ahead and reach out to someone in customer support. What's interesting is I didn't tell it anything about that. It just knew that this was a customer support use case. Like, I didn't program that in. So this is just a look at the logic app itself. Nothing overly complex, exposing basically a location as a string as an input. We're going to go ahead, in this case, query Dataverse. We're going to find any tickets where that city is equal to Kirkland, and then we're going to just respond with all of those results. And then, if you wanted to go ahead and sort of embed this in a custom application, they provide you some sample code that you can go ahead and basically expose or export, copy and paste, and then be able to go ahead and include in your application. Okay, looks like I'm a little bit short on time here. So another partnership that we've worked on is Semantic Kernel. And so Semantic Kernel is more of a codeful approach of building some of these conversational chat experiences. And you can go ahead and author some code and then wire up logic apps as a plugin as well. This was something that was announced at Build. They've put together a blog post, the Semantic Kernel team, and that's something that you can go ahead and take a look at as well. All right, so I think this is my last slide, but just in terms of our roadmap. So I showed you sort of the RAG pattern. I showed you the ingestion and the search workflows. There was a few extra steps there that we feel we can simplify. For example, that one tokenize method that called an Azure function, that's something that we can offset from you folks having to go ahead and implement that. So that's something that we're going to work with that team on, making it a built-in action. And that should just sort of simplify things even further, from 10 actions to maybe 8 or 7. Some additional built-in actions related to document parsing and chunking. We're also working on Python support. Wagner had mentioned that yesterday, so if you wanted to author custom Python code, we'll support that as well. And then there's just some additional templates as well. We talked about templates yesterday, but I think there's also a sweet spot when we talk about Azure OpenAI and giving you some prescribed templates that you can use based on particular solutions as well. And then also, this is another big ask that we've had from others just in general around easy auth for authenticating HTTP triggers. We support it today, but you have to do that through an API. That's something we're looking on simplifying as well. Last slide. This is just, once again, my personal opinion. People are always wanting to learn more about AI. These are some of the resources that I've leveraged recently and highly recommended. Some of these folks are related to Microsoft, but once again, personal opinion. But The Coming Wave by Mustafa Suleyman, who's the CEO of AI. He just joined Microsoft a couple months ago. Kevin Scott, our EVP and CTO, authored a great book on sort of the society impacts of AI. And then last but not least, this is a podcast. It's called Possible. Reid Hoffman and Aria Finger. Reid's a LinkedIn co-founder. He's also a Microsoft board member. But once again, amazing resources in terms of like the applications of AI and for better or for worse. But I think the most important thing is for people to be educated and to continue to learn about this space. It's not going to be perfect, but it's without question game-changing. It's going to be a huge disruptive force, and I feel it's one of those things where it's better to be informed than not, so you can kind of make your own decisions around these things. So I think my time's up, so I'll leave it there, but feel free to find me out in the hall with any questions. Happy to chat further about this. So thanks again.